The barrel leaves the port of Ras Tanura on a Tuesday morning, 42,000 gallons of crude oil destined for a refinery outside Shanghai. The invoice will be written in dollars. The payment will clear through correspondent banks in New York. And yet, somewhere in the machinery of this transaction, invisible to the workers, loading the tanker, unknown to the traders, watching their screens, a question hangs in the air like the smell of salt and petroleum. How much longer will this be true? For half a century, oil has spoken the language of dollars. Not because of chemistry or geology, but because of decisions made in hotel suites and palace halls, because of aircraft carriers and treasury bonds, because of handshakes between men in suits who understood that money, like power, is ultimately a matter of collective belief. The petrodollar system, the arrangement by which the world's most vital commodity prices itself in America's currency, has been so stable, so seemingly permanent, that we've stopped seeing it as a choice. We've mistaken architecture for nature. But architecture can be redesigned, and in Beijing, in Riyadh, in Moscow, and Abu Dhabi, the blueprints are already being drawn. This is not a story about the inevitable collapse of American power, nor is it a story about the unstoppable rise of China. It is something more nuanced and more interesting. A story about how monetary systems emerge from the deeper currents of geopolitics, how they shape and are shaped by human psychology, and how the slow accumulation of small changes can, under the right conditions, produce transformations that seem sudden only to those who weren't paying attention. To understand what might be ending, we must first understand what was built. The year is 1944, and representatives from 44 nations gather at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. World War II still rages, but the Allied powers are already thinking past victory, toward the architecture of peace. What emerges from this conference is not merely a set of exchange rates, but a new monetary order, the dollar pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, all other currencies pegged to the dollar. The United States, holding 2/3 of the world's gold reserves and emerging from the war with its industrial capacity intact, while Europe lies in ruins, becomes the anchor of global finance. This arrangement grants America what Valéry Giscard d'Estaing would later call an exorbitant privilege, the ability to print the money that others must earn, to run trade deficits that would sink any other nation, to export inflation and import goods with currency created at will. But privilege carries obligation. For Bretton Woods to function, the United States must maintain gold convertibility, must restrain its monetary impulses, must play the role of responsible steward, even when domestic politics demand otherwise. By 1971, that restraint has broken. The Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, rising competition from rebuilt European and Japanese industries will place impossible demands on American gold reserves. On August 15th, President Richard Nixon appears on television to announce what will be called the Nixon shock. The United States is closing the gold window. Dollars will no longer be convertible to gold. The Bretton Woods system collapses almost overnight. What follows is not chaos, but something more interesting: improvisation. The world now operates on pure fiat currency, money backed by nothing except faith in the issuing government. For such a system to work, that faith must be actively maintained. And here is where oil enters the story. October 1973. OPEC declares an oil embargo against nations supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadruple. The industrial economies built on assumptions of cheap energy stagger under the weight of stagflation, simultaneous inflation, and unemployment, a combination that classical economics suggested was impossible. The crisis reveals a new reality. Whoever controls the flow and pricing of oil controls the lifeblood of industrial civilization. Henry Kissinger, serving as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, recognizes the opportunity within the crisis. If the United States cannot back its currency with gold, perhaps it can back it with something even more essential: energy itself. Through a series of negotiations in 1974 and 75, an arrangement takes shape with Saudi Arabia, OPEC's dominant producer. The Saudis will price their oil exclusively in dollars and will invest their surplus revenues, the petrodollars, in U.S. Treasury securities. In exchange, the United States will provide military protection, advanced weapon systems, and a security umbrella for the Saudi regime. This is more than a bilateral trade agreement. It creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Nations need dollars to buy oil, which means they must earn dollars through trade with America. or hold dollar reserves, which means they invest those reserves in dollar-denominated assets, which finances American deficits, which allows America to maintain the military presence that guarantees the security of the oil producers. The circle closes perfectly. Other oil exporters follow Saudi Arabia's lead. OPEC's production becomes denominated in dollars. The petrodollar system emerges not from treaty or international law, but from the gravitational pull of rational self-interest aligned with military power. It is, in its way, a masterpiece of strategic design invisible infrastructure that channels the flows of global commerce through American banks, reinforcing dollar dominance with every transaction. To understand why this arrangement persisted for 50 years, we must understand something about human behavior and institutional systems. Path dependency is the term economists use for how our choices become constrained by our previous choices. Once a system achieves critical mass, switching costs become enormous. Every contract written in dollars, every central bank holding dollar reserves, every correspondent banking relationship, these are not just economic facts, but social and political relationships, built up over decades, embedded in bureaucracies and careers and national strategies. There is also the matter of trust, which in monetary systems is not emotional but structural. Nations accept dollars not because they love America, but because they believe other nations will accept dollars tomorrow. This collective belief, once established, becomes self-fulfilling. The dollar's value rests not on gold or oil, but on the shared conviction that it will remain valuably a psychological foundation that, for all its apparent fragility, has proven remarkably durable. Yet every system, no matter how elegantly designed, carries within it the seeds of its own transformation. The contradictions accumulate slowly at first, then faster. There is the Tryphon dilemma, named for the economist Robert Tryphon, who identified it in 1960 for the dollar to serve as global reserve currency. The United States must run persistent trade deficits to supply the world with dollar liquidity, but those same deficits inevitably undermine confidence in the dollar's long-term value. It is a paradox with no clean solution, a structural flaw papered over by American power and the absence of alternatives. Then comes the gradual weaponization of the dollar system itself. Sanctions have always been a tool of statecraft, but in the 21st century they become surgical and devastating. Iran in 2012 cut off from SWIFT the messaging system that enables international banking. Russia in 2014, after Crimea, again in 2022, after Ukraine. Each time the message is clear. Participation in the dollar system is a privilege that can be revoked. This demonstrates American power. But it also demonstrates vulnerability, not America's vulnerability, but the vulnerability of any nation holding significant dollar reserves or depending on dollar-denominated trade. If the same system that enables global commerce can be shut off at the discretion of Washington, then every finance minister, every central banker, must ask themselves, are we comfortable with this single point of failure? The question becomes urgent in 2008. The global financial crisis originates in American subprime mortgages, spreads through American investment banks, and requires a Federal Reserve response of unprecedented scale quantitative easing, the creation of trillions of dollars to prevent systemic collapse. The strategy works in the sense that it prevents a second Great Depression, but it also plants doubts. If dollars can be created in such quantities, if the Federal Reserve's balance sheet can expand from under $1 trillion to over $4 trillion, what does this mean for the long-term value of dollar reserves held by sovereign nations? China watches with particular attention. By this point, China has accumulated over $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, the fruits of decades of export-led growth. This is simultaneously a source of strength and a profound vulnerability. China cannot divest these holdings without crashing their value. China cannot spend them without driving up the yuan's value and destroying export competitiveness. They are, in effect, trapped by their own success into financing American deficits in perpetuity. From Beijing's perspective, this looks less like the natural order of economics and more like a carefully constructed asymmetry of power. And asymmetries, once recognized, invite correction. Saudi Arabia faces its own accumulating doubts, though from a different direction. The relationship with America has never been simpler. Conservative Islamic monarchy dependent on a secular democratic power, partners more of necessity than of affinity. But necessity has always been enough. Until it isn't. The signals accumulate. In 2015, when Houthi rebels backed by Iran launched drone attacks on Saudi oil facilities, damaging production capacity, the American response is muted. This is not 1991, when Iraq's invasion of Kuwait triggered immediate American military intervention. The world has changed. American energy independence, achieved through the shale revolution, means Saudi oil is no longer critical to American strategic interests. The old bargain oil for security rests on foundations that have quietly eroded. Then comes the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, a journalist and dissident killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The international outcry is fierce. The American response during the Trump administration is muted. During the Biden administration, it is more forceful. The relationship between President Biden and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman becomes openly strained. The Crown Prince, young and ambitious architect of Vision 2030 to diversify the Saudi economy, finds himself treated not as an essential partner, but as a sometimes useful problem. These are not abstract diplomatic slights. They are data points in a calculation about reliability. If American security guarantees cannot be counted upon, if American political winds shift with domestic concerns that have nothing to do with Saudi interests, then diversification becomes not an ideological choice, but a risk management necessity. Human beings and nations alike share certain patterns of behavior under uncertainty. We hedge, we diversify. We avoid putting all our eggs in one basket, especially when we've seen that basket dropped before. The psychology that leads an investor to balance a portfolio leads a nation to balance its great power relationships. The same instincts that make sense at the individual level scale up to the level of states. Meanwhile, in Shanghai, new architecture is taking shape. March 2018, the Shanghai International Energy Exchange launches crude oil futures contracts denominated in yuan and convertible to gold. This is not merely a new financial instrument, but a potential alternative to the petrodollar architecture. A Chinese refinery can now buy oil futures in yuan, settle in yuan, and theoretically never touch the dollar system. The contracts are backed by the possibility of gold conversion. An attempt to solve the closed-loop problem: what do you do with yuan if you don't want to buy Chinese goods? The initial volumes are modest. Old systems have tremendous inertia. Traders prefer deep, liquid markets, where large positions can be entered and exited without moving prices. The dollar oil market offers this. The yuan oil market does not, at least not yet. Network effects favor the incumbent. Every new participant makes the network more valuable, but the first participants bear the risk of an illiquid market. Yet the infrastructure exists, and infrastructure, once built, can be scaled. Alongside the oil futures comes CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, China's alternative to SWIFT. It processes yuan transactions between international banks, providing a payment rail that runs outside Western control. If SWIFT access can be weaponized, if being cut off from SWIFT can cripple an economy, then CIPS represents not just an alternative, but an insurance policy. Then there are the bilateral currency swap agreements, arrangements between central banks to exchange currencies directly without going through dollar intermediation. China has established these with dozens of countries, including, significantly, Saudi Arabia. These swaps provide liquidity for direct yuan-rial trade, creating channels for commerce that bypass New York entirely. The Belt and Road Initiative, announced in 2013, accelerates these trends. China finances infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and beyond: ports, railways, power plants with loans denominated increasingly in yuan. Nations that borrow yuan must earn yuan to repay, which means trading with China in yuan, which means developing yuan-denominated supply chains. Each project is a thread in a larger fabric, weaving together an economic sphere where the yuan becomes not dominant but normal, one currency among several rather than a distant alternative to dollar hegemony. This is where Chinese strategic culture reveals itself as distinct from American approaches. Where American policy tends toward quarterly thinking, toward immediate results and visible wins, Chinese planning operates on generational timescales. The question is not whether the yuan becomes the global reserve currency next year, but whether, in 20 or 30 years, a multipolar currency system emerges in which the yuan is a major player. Patient accumulation of small advantages, the creation of facts on the ground, the building of infrastructure that will shape future decisions. This is the method. The concept of Tianxia, an ancient Chinese idea, often translated as all under heaven, offers insight here. It describes not a binary world of hegemon versus challenger, but a graduated system of concentric circles, zones of influence overlapping and shifting, hierarchy based on civilization and culture rather than conquest. Whether China's modern leaders consciously draw on this tradition is less important than recognizing that their vision of global order may not be to replace American unipolarity with Chinese unipolarity, but to create genuine multipolarity, a world where multiple currencies, multiple payment systems, multiple poles of power exist simultaneously. This is not altruism. It is recognition that China's economy is too intertwined with the global system to benefit from chaos, that a gradual transition serves Chinese interests better than a sudden crisis. That influence comes as much from being indispensable to others as from dominating them. But for this alternative architecture to matter, nations must choose to use it. And that choice happens not in economic seminars, but in the messy reality of geopolitics. 2022 becomes a crucible. Russia invades Ukraine in February. The Western response is swift and severe. Not just diplomatic condemnation, but economic isolation on a scale never before attempted against a major economy. Russian banks are cut from SWIFT. Russian central bank reserves held in Western institutions are frozen. The ruble, denied access to international payment systems, collapses. Then something interesting happens. Russia and China expand their energy trade, settling in yuan and rubles. Russia begins selling oil to India at discounted prices, payment in non-dollar currencies. What was theoretical becomes operational. The alternative infrastructure, built over the previous decade, suddenly proves its value not as a future possibility, but as a present necessity. This is the unintended consequence of weaponized finance. Every demonstration of power is simultaneously a demonstration of risk. Every nation watching Russia's isolation must calculate, could this happen to us? And if so, shouldn't we prepare alternatives? For Saudi Arabia, the calculation becomes acute. The kingdom cannot afford to choose sides in a new Cold War between the United States and China. Saudi Arabia needs American military technology and security guarantees. But Saudi Arabia also needs Chinese purchases of oil, Chinese investment in Vision 2030 projects, Chinese technology for the diversified economy Crown Prince Mohammed envisions. In December 2022, President Xi Jinping visits Riyadh. The optics are carefully choreographed a welcome, far warmer than President Biden received months earlier. Ceremonies emphasizing partnership and respect. Substance accompanies symbolism. Energy deals, technology agreements, investment commitments, and, reported though not confirmed, discussions about settling Saudi oil sales to China in yuan. This is where we must be precise about what is actually changing and what remains rhetoric. As of the most recent data, the overwhelming majority of global oil transactions still clear in dollars. The yuan's share of global central bank reserves remains around 2.5%, compared to the dollar's 58%. The daily volume of foreign exchange trading in yuan is a fraction of dollar volumes. The U.S. Treasury market's depth and liquidity remain unmatched. The petrodollar system is not ending, but it is being supplemented, diluted, gradually surrounded by alternatives that reduce its monopoly without replacing it entirely. Think of it as the difference between a single highway and a network of roads. The highway is faster, more efficient, the obvious choice for most journeys. But if the highway has tolls that can be raised arbitrarily, if access can be denied for political reasons, if the highway's maintenance becomes uncertain, then the existence of alternative routes of all less convenient routes changes the calculation. You might still use the highway most of the time, but you're not dependent on it. And that shift from dependence to optionality is itself a form of power redistribution. Human decision-making under uncertainty follows predictable patterns. We overweight recent events. Russia's sanctions loom large in central bankers' minds. We prefer reversible choices to irreversible ones. Keeping dollars while adding yuan is safer than abandoning dollars for yuan. We imitate peers. If Brazil and the UAE explore yuan trade, others consider it. We're loss-averse. The fear of being cut off from dollar systems may outweigh the inefficiency of maintaining multiple currency reserves. These psychological tendencies, aggregated across dozens of nations and thousands of decision-makers, create momentum toward diversification, even absent any coordinated plan. No conspiracy is needed, no grand alliance, just the accumulated weight of individual choices, each rationale from the actor's perspective, producing a systemic shift. The geopolitical chessboard makes this shift both possible and complicated. The Middle East is undergoing a transformation as profound as any since the end of the Cold War. The Abraham Accords of 2020 normalize relations between Israel and several Arab states, reshaping regional alliances. Iran and Saudi Arabia, enemies for decades, restored diplomatic relations in 2023 with Chinese mediation, a diplomatic coup that demonstrates China's growing role as regional power broker. The United States, meanwhile, signals strategic reorientation. The pivot to Asia, announced during the Obama administration, reflects a judgment that the Pacific, not the Middle East, is the critical theater for 21st century competition. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2020 reinforces perceptions, deserved or not, of American retreat from the region. This creates space, not empty space, but space that other powers can occupy. China steps into this space, not with military bases and troop deployments, but with economic engagement, investment, and the patient construction of dependencies through debt and development. For the Gulf monarchies, this is both opportunity and danger. They can play great powers against each other, maximizing leverage and autonomy. But they can also find themselves caught between incompatible demands, forced eventually to choose sides in a competition they would prefer to avoid. This balancing act recalls the Cold War's non-aligned movement nations like India, Yugoslavia, and Egypt that sought to navigate between American and Soviet blocs, extracting benefits from both while committing fully to neither. That movement's success was mixed. Some nations thrived, others collapsed under the contradictions. The lesson is that hedging is a strategy, but not a permanent solution. Eventually, systems clarify, alignments harden, or do they? Perhaps the unique feature of this moment is that the old binary structure, you're either with us or against us, no longer applies. In an interconnected global economy where supply chains span continents and capital flows cross borders in milliseconds, the costs of choosing sides become prohibitive. Europe cannot simply decouple from China without devastating its industries. America cannot simply decouple from China without impoverishing its consumers. And China cannot simply decouple from the West without strangling its own growth. This mutual interdependence might prevent the kind of bloc formation that defined the 20th century's Cold War. But it also creates enormous complexity for every nation trying to navigate the currents. There is no playbook for this. No historical precedent maps perfectly onto the present. The energy transition adds another layer of uncertainty. If we are approaching peak oil demand, if electric vehicles and renewable energy gradually reduce the world's thirst for petroleum, then does the Petroyuan question become moot before it's resolved? Why fight over the currency denomination of a commodity that's losing its centrality to the global economy? But this analysis may be premature. The energy transition will take decades. Fossil fuels will remain critical to transportation, manufacturing, chemicals, and plastics, long after wealthy nations electrify their vehicle fleets. And the nations driving future oil demand, India, Southeast Asia, Africa, are precisely those most interested in alternatives to dollar dominance. Moreover, the transition itself requires financing. Solar farms, wind turbines, battery factories, electric grids. The infrastructure of a renewable future requires investment on a scale that dwarfs anything in history. What currency will finance this transition? If Chinese companies manufacture most solar panels and batteries, if Chinese banks provide the project financing, might this infrastructure price in yuan the way oil infrastructure priced in dollars? The irony would be profound. The petrodollar system could give way not to a Petroyuan, but to a volti. The currency denomination shifting from the old energy economy to the new one, the underlying logic of power and commerce remaining constant even as the specific mechanisms transform. So where does this leave us? Not at the end of the petrodollar, but possibly in the beginning of its end of phase that may itself last decades. We can sketch scenarios without predicting which will prevail. In the first scenario, the petrodollar persists. The United States renews its commitment to Gulf security, demonstrates reliability as an ally, and the network effects of the dollar system prove too strong to overcome. China's economy slows, demographic decline undermines its long-term prospects, and capital controls prevent the yuan from becoming fully convertible. The alternatives remain marginal. This is not impossible. Systems have tremendous inertia. In the second scenario, perhaps most likely, we see gradual diversification. The dollar's share of global reserves declines from 58% to 40 or 45% over 15 or 20 years. The yuan rises to 10 or 15%. The euro holds stable. Multiple currencies become normal in international trade. Oil transactions occur in a mix of currencies, with dollar dominance reduced but not eliminated. No crisis precipitates this. It emerges from the accumulated weight of individual decisions by central bankers and trade ministers, each seeking to reduce risk through diversification. This multipolar monetary world would be more complex, more fragmented, but not necessarily more unstable. It would resemble the international monetary system of the 19th century more than the dollar hegemony of the late 20th. Multiple reserve currencies, gold playing a role regional currency, blocks handling most trade, only the largest transactions requiring conversion to the dominant currency. The third scenario is the crisis scenario, low probability but high impact. Some shock triggers rapid flight from dollar assets, a U.S. debt crisis, a catastrophic military conflict, a Federal Reserve policy mistake that destroys confidence. The transition happens not over decades, but over months, with cascading effects through bond markets, currency markets, trade flows. This would be profoundly destabilizing, likely requiring emergency international coordination to prevent global depression. History offers both comfort and warning here. The British pound's decline as reserve currency took 50 years, from the 1920s to the 1970s, and the world survived. But the gold standard's collapse in the 1930s was chaotic and contributed to the economic misery that bred fascism and war. The difference was speed and management. Gradual transitions can be absorbed. Sudden shocks breed chaos. The fourth scenario involves technological disruption. Central bank digital currencies mature to the point where nations can transact directly, central bank to central bank, without needing a reserve currency at all. Or more speculatively, some new form of currency, perhaps a basket of commodities or a cryptocurrency, with actual stability and governmental backing, emerges as a neutral alternative that no single nation controls. This scenario faces enormous coordination problems. Who sets the rules? Who provides liquidity? Who serves as lender of last resort in the petrodollar system's strength has been that these questions have clear answers. The United States does all three. Any replacement must solve these problems, and solving them requires trust and cooperation that currently seem absent. What should we watch for as this unfolds? Numbers matter. The actual volume of yuan-denominated oil contracts executed, not just announced, the composition of central bank reserves released quarterly by the IMF, the transaction volumes flowing through SIPs versus SWIFT, the locations and frequency of summit meetings between leaders, where Saudi Arabia lists the next tranche of Aramco shares, whether Saudi Arabia issues bonds in yuan. These are leading indicators, signals in the noise. But we should watch psychological and behavioral indicators too. When finance ministers discuss currency policy, do they speak of the dollar as inevitable or as one option among several? When oil companies negotiate long-term contracts, do they automatically default to dollars, or do they now consider alternatives? When journalists write about reserve currencies, do they frame it as dollar or yuan, or as a multipolar future? Language shapes thought, and shifts in how we talk about these systems reveal shifts in how we conceive of what's possible. The humans at the center of this story, the central bankers, the energy ministers, the crown princes and presidents, are making decisions under profound uncertainty. They have incomplete information, conflicting incentives, and constituencies with different time horizons. A Saudi planner thinking about Vision 2030 operates on a different timescale than an American congressman facing re-election in 2 years. A Chinese Politburo member thinking about the century of humiliation and national restoration sees different stakes than a European finance minister worried about next quarter's inflation numbers. These different temporalities and perspectives ensure that no single narrative will satisfy everyone. No single outcome will benefit all parties equally. This is not a story with a villain and a hero, not a morality play about the triumph of one system over another. It is a story about how collective human choices, constrained by geography and technology and history and psychology, produce emergent patterns that no individual fully controls or comprehends. The Bangladeshi worker in Riyadh, sending remittances home in rials pegged $2, doesn't think about reserve currencies. The Chinese refinery manager, negotiating for Saudi crude, cares about price and delivery, not the philosophy of monetary systems. The American consumer filling their gas tank has no idea that the price they pay connects to geopolitical decisions made 50 years ago and being unmade now. Yet all their lives are shaped by this architecture, visible or not. This is perhaps the deepest truth about monetary systems. They are simultaneously the most abstract and most concrete. Manifestations of power, abstract because they rest ultimately on collective belief, on the shared fiction that pieces of paper or digital ledger entries have value. Concrete because that belief translates directly into the ability to buy food, fuel, armies, build cities, shape futures. When the petrodollar system was constructed in the 1970s, it seemed a clever solution to a temporary crisis. 50 years later, it has become embedded in the deep structure of how the world works. Its potential unwinding is not the end of an empire. Empires don't end, they transform into something else. It is the transformation of one set of arrangements into another, driven by the same forces that created the original system, the pursuit of security, the quest for advantage, the eternal negotiation between power and trust. That tanker crossing the Indian Ocean, carrying Saudi crude to Shanghai, the invoice, might still read in dollars today, but the bank accounts are already multiplying, the payment channels diversifying, the options expanding. The question isn't whether the petrodollar will end, but what comes next, and whether that transition unfolds smoothly or chaotically, quickly or across generations. The answer is being written now, not in master plans or grand strategies, but in the accumulated decisions of thousands of actors, each responding to incentives, navigating uncertainties, trying to secure advantage while managing risk. Out of this chaos, order will eventually emerge. But which order, shaped by whose interests, reflecting whose values, this remains uncertain. And so we watch. We pay attention to the signals, to the shifts in language and policy, to the construction of infrastructure, both physical and financial. We remember that monetary systems are human creations, not natural laws, and that what humans have built, humans can rebuild differently. We recognize that change, when it comes to systems this large and complex, usually arrives not as revolution, but as evolutions too slow to see day by day, undeniable when viewed across decades. The Petroyuan question in the end is not about yuan or dollars. It is about how power flows through the modern world, about whether that power will remain concentrated or become distributed, about whether the 21st century will resemble the 20th or will inaugurate something genuinely new. The answer matters for the tanker captain and the refinery manager, for the central banker and the everyday consumer, for everyone navigating an economic system built for a world that is, perhaps, already passing away.